Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPR is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Now, the English poet John Milton tells us in Book 6 of Paradise Lost that after the first day of the great war in heaven, the rebel angels, having been beaten back, gather for the next move. Satan is convinced that the grievous injury they have suffered is owed to inferiority in weapons. And he says, perhaps more valid arms, weapons more violent, when next we meet, may serve to better us and worth our foes, or equal what between us made the odds in nature none. After hearing of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Bernard Brodie, or should I say Bernard Brodie, since he's an American, then a young assistant professor at Yale, is reported to have said to his wife, "Everything I've written so far has become redundant." Later in the book, The Absolute Weapon, he summarized the situation in these words, and I quote, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other purpose," unquote. And gradually, two schools of thought emerged, one led by Herman Kahn, the other by Thomas Schelling. Kahn argued for escalation dominance. Schelling drew on the uncertainties inherent in the escalation process to achieve deterrence. While Kahn's strategy of escalation dominance argued for the process being controlled by the state dominating escalation, Schelling advocated letting a situation intentionally degrade so an adversary would conclude that it would be better to turn away from the brink. In the end, frankly, if you ask me, the world was lucky that neither theory got tested. Or to use Lawrence Friedman's words, the fundamental dilemma of nuclear strategy remained as intractable as ever. The problem is central to what the nuclear club calls nuclear strategy. Trying to figure out how to fight a war and win it when the only ultima ratio must be to avoid it. This is also the central contradiction: to argue for nuclear weapons on the basis of deterrence, which is balance of terror, and then to formulate strategies and find technologies to dilute it. If both sides have Achilles' lance, both will stay away. But the sides also want his shield. So whoever has it can use his lance but protect himself from the other's lance. This central contradiction is the deliberate attempt to move away from balance of terror to creating an imbalance of terror, to use Clarice Delpech phrase in a different context. This is plain dangerous for the world, but it has kept the club thriving, frankly, and conferences and publications alive, so everyone is happy. I remember the flurry of conferences arranged by IISS after the 98 nuclear tests by India and Pakistan, exotic locations. We went round in circles in the conference room during the day and enjoyed the evenings. So today I want to discuss the nuclear environment in South and Southern Asia, but also place the issue in a broader perspective given the changing geopolitical realities and the troublesome dilution of international legal norms. I have with me Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan. She's a resident senior fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Canberra. And prior to joining ASPI, she was the director of the Center for Security Strategy and Technology at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. In 2018-19, Dr. Rajagopalan was the technical advisor to the United Nations group of governmental experts on prevention of arms race in outer space. She joined ORF after a 5-year stint at the National Security Council Secretariat with Government of India, where she was an assistant director. She has authored several books, including Nuclear Security in India. With her is Dr. Mansoor Ahmed. Ahmed is an honorary lecturer in the Strategic and Defense Studies Center, Australian National University. He has worked at CISS Islamabad as a senior research fellow from 2018 to 22 and as lecturer in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at the Quaid-e-Azam University from 2011 to 2015. His research work has been published by the Belfer Center, the Stimson Center, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School. He's also the author of Pakistan's Pathway to the Bomb. Thank you so much for being on the program. Let me begin with Dr. Rajagopalan here. I was just reading one of the pieces that you did for USIP. It's a bit of an irony because apparently USIP is now closed, except for some skeleton staff. That, of course, is not because of your article that you wrote for them, but because of President Trump. And so that article is basically your interviews with a number of Indian scholars, policy makers, think tankers, and the rest in terms of Chinese nuclear thinking and development. And one of the things that you mentioned, there are lots of things, and we'll discuss them. But one of the sentences caught my attention, which was that a state that has a declaratory no first use policy is a responsible state. I find that I know I'm trying to look for a word. Okay, let me put it like this, since I can't find the right word. Since NFU is a declaratory policy and does not really have much significance in operational terms, wouldn't it be more responsible for a state to actually say that we've got the weapons and we're going to use them? And I'm not even getting to the point where there are a number of incidents, as noted by scholars across the world, which seem to indicate that the Indian NFU policy in operational terms might just be for the birds.
Okay, thank you. And let me quickly say we all live in a very interesting times, of course. So clearly, USIP going through whatever it is due to the new administration, it's a very different thing. But I did this special report for the United States Institute of Peace, which was to look at providing an Indian assessment on sort of what the Chinese nuclear developments are all about, especially the recent developments in terms of China's nuclear expansion, modernization that is in India that China has undertaken. I think this was something that was very important to me because I think whatever China does, it has ripple effects. It has multiple effects across the region and beyond. One, of course, it triggers certain amount of response from India, and thereafter, then Pakistan possibly follows that. So there is going to be a spillover effect that goes well beyond China alone, in a sense. So I think that was the context to why I wanted to look at it. But again, given the sensitivity of the subject and kind of things, obviously this report was done with interviews with recently retired military officials, former strategic forces commanders, diplomats who have tackled all of these issues. But on the question of the NFU policy or the first use policy, you have weapons, and why not declare that you are going to use them? I think different states have different assumptions on the role that it sees for its nuclear weapons. China and India, in many ways, have a similar philosophy when it comes to nuclear weapons, which is that these are political weapons at the end of the day. These do not have, both countries do not look at from a military utility of nuclear weapons perspective. So they have, both the countries have taken a very different approach to Pakistan and some of the other countries that may have had very different approach to it. That again depends on the kind of security environment that prevails and the kind of the military strategy, overall conventional military strategy, and a whole range of factors come to influence the kind of position that we take or the kind of doctrine that we come to adopt, in a sense. So in the case of India and even China, which had about till a few years ago, China had something like 300 nuclear warheads, and China had a reasonably small size nuclear arsenal, and it still has an NFU policy and NFU doctrine in place. But I do believe that China's own NFU is beginning to change, and maybe India will also change in due course of time, looking at the developments in the broader Southern Asian context, for instance. In my interviews, but also my own reading of China's posture is that given the kind of China's nuclear expansion that we see today, it really does not match with, there is some sort of a mismatch between the size of the nuclear arsenal, the growing size of China's nuclear arsenal, and the NFU policy. It is a sort of second. I think it's also becoming a lot more flexible, more dynamic, the China's NFU policy, wherein within the NFU policy itself, so China may not walk out of the NFU policy, but within that NFU posture itself, China is already developing certain flexibility. So on launch on warning posture is also being thought through, and which also would mean that China has managed to have substantial amount of early warning systems in place through a series of sensors, satellite-based sources, and so on and so forth. That is number one. Second, China is also being assisted by Russia. The Russia-China sort of collaboration in this particular space, I think that's also kind of aiding China to engage in possibly coming to a sort of a launch on warning low posture in a sense. So I think China, even though China may not really walk out of an NFU policy, because it does give China certain amount of moralistic as well as normative strength to show that China is a responsible stakeholder. But at the same time, it appears to be the case that it is developing certain capabilities through which it can actually engage in a launch on warning option as well.
Right. Without prejudice to what you're saying, see, the thing is, in terms of post-composition, in terms of modernization, in terms of certain flexibilities that you build into your triad, a similar argument can be made for India, by the way. There's a compilation edited by Levine and Tong Zhao, which was put out by the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And some of the arguments that they make is, of course, there's a conversation going on in China with reference to how China should respond. A similar conversation has been going on in India also. And one of the things that, catching up to the Western style of thinking, there are experts in China who are talking about the fact that China should respond on, launch under attack. There's a fringe which refers to launch on warning, but this particular thinking still sticks to NFU, but launch under attack instead of the traditional Chinese thinking of launch after attack, maybe days after the attack has happened. And this is basically, as far as the Chinese are concerned, frankly, it's not with reference to India at all. It's with reference to the United States. It's with reference to the US's ISR capabilities, the fact that a preemptive US strike can take out a smaller Chinese force, etc., etc. But all of this, frankly, it goes back to what I said in my introduction with reference to the central contradiction of nuclear strategy. And the people who are responsible for this central contradiction is the club, the nuclear strategists. On the one hand, we talk about these being political weapons, on the other, with no particular military use except for deterrence. And on the other hand, we create, things in terms of, not just formulating strategies, but also technology demonstrators, which actually serve to dilute deterrence. But let me bring in Dr. Ahmed here. Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Rajagopalan has mentioned that Chinese do certain things with reference to the United States, then India takes note, and then India tries to do catch up, and then of course Pakistan has, in terms of the South Asian dyad, Pakistan has to do certain things. I've seen over the last 4 or 5 years people increasingly making this strategic chain argument. And of course, it's there. But the fact is that it also serves to stymie bilateral attempts to towards confidence building measures through caps on certain technologies and various other measures that can be taken to reduce nuclear risk. You have obviously, I mentioned you've written a book on Pakistan's nuclear strategies and programs. How would you look at what we have discussed so far and then juxtapose it with reference to Pakistani approaches?
Well, thank you. As I was reading Raji's report, I was thinking that if we were to substitute China for India, it would probably be a more accurate assessment. India is pursuing a strategy of enhancing its ability for assured retaliation and at the same time putting in elements for building the capability towards damage limitation. Now, given the geographical proximity in South Asia between China, India, and Pakistan, I think anything that is being built or deployed either against China or Pakistan can be redeployed, repositioned, repurposed for either of the two of India's adversaries. So, while having said that, I mean, Pakistan has put forward the proposal of strategic restraint regime as far back as October 1998, right after the nuclear tests, and it has reaffirmed that this is still on the table. Now, what I've come across, Indian perspectives in track twos, etc., is that because of the China-India dyad, that is not probably not doable for India in the current circumstances, given the two-front threat. But my assessment is that given the change, the shift in the conventional balance of forces, historically it was an acute imbalance in favor of India, which endured for many, many decades. But over the past decade or so, given Pakistan's own force modernization, especially in the Air Force and land forces, and to some extent in the Navy, and because of the two-front threat, given that India has had to deploy at least two of its offensive strike corps and some other elements along the line of actual control, I think the resultant force balances are now such that the asymmetry has narrowed down to the point where India does not have a decisive edge over Pakistan. But that does not mean that the same forces that are deployed against China can be repurposed or redeployed, cannot be repurposed or redeployed against Pakistan. But in the India-Pakistan dyad, I think new conventional force reductions as part of the strategic restraint regime are still doable. There can be force zones for non-deployment of certain types of offensive systems. There could be certain types of missile systems that both countries pledge should not be nuclearized. Or, more importantly, there needs to be nuclear risk reduction between the two countries that can lead towards incremental steps towards confidence building and then arms control.
Yeah. Dr. Rajagopalan, there is also an issue of hotlines. And BASIC just did a report where they asked Brigadier Zahir Kazmi, a former Brigadier Zahir Kazmi from Pakistan, and former Brigadier Arun Sehgal from India to answer three questions with reference to the Balakot Pulwama crisis back in Feb 2019. I don't know if you've come across that report, but it's very instructive in the sense that the lessons learned are not mutual. Two people are looking at the same chronology of events and drawing completely different lessons. So if the hotlines are not being used during a crisis, or one or both sides is reluctant to use those hotlines until that side goes into a particular action, then we have got a problem. Because we go back to the central dilemma of CBMs. They work the best when you need them the least. So that's one thing. The other thing is that despite this two-front situation and all of that, and I agree with Dr. Ahmed with reference to sort of lowering of the conventional asymmetries for several reasons. But the fact is that if you, even as I speak to you, if you look at the Indian order of battle, most of it is still geared towards Pakistan, and the corps in terms of lower fighting echelons have greater numbers of those fighting echelons than, facing China across another very long border. So given, and of course, the fact that, which is known, that Pakistan and India are not even engaging, the Indian government has gone to the extent of not even allowing the Indian cricket team to play in Pakistan, which is why, unfortunately, the final of the Champions Trophy was played in Dubai and not in Lahore. So given the overall tenor of relations and also the problems in terms of conflict resolution or conflict management, do you think that there is need to begin to think anew, even when you cannot change the nature of the overall relation, to actually target certain areas with reference to reducing risk of conflict and also reducing risk of the conflict escalating to the nuclear level?
Okay, let me, I think, respond to, bunch of comments, including from Ahmed, in a sense. I think when I look at it, I think India's focus from the late 90s, I think it has been China, China, China. I think one has to take that point very clearly. India's capability requirement in terms of conventional capabilities, in terms of even on the nuclear domain, when you look at it, India's nuclear weapons, there has not been a massive expansion. We have developed something like from 98 to what India's nuclear arsenal size today is, maybe 4.5, 5 weapons per year. That's not a massive expansion. But India is focused on developing longer range missiles, longer range delivery systems to target all of China. That will continue to be the goal for the Indian nuclear expansion, whenever, at whatever pace it happens. So I think that's something that we need to get that very, very clear, that India's focus is not Pakistan. Of course, it is going to have, like Ahmed said, it can be repurposed to another theater, because if you are developing a longer range system that can also apply to Pakistan, that is a possibility. That's a possibility I'm not ruling out, and that might be one of the security anxieties that would play around calculations from a Pakistani perspective. But the fact is that for India, the key is China. And China, what China does, overall, India-China political and strategic relations, they are not at its best. They have not been for quite some time. And they are, in my view, that relationship is not going to improve significantly. We might see some slight improvement in terms of, we might sign a border patrol management agreement and so on and so forth, but that is not going to alter the basic nature of India-China relations, which also means that India's capability development in the overall in the military security sector will be even more China focused, whether it is in terms of nuclear capabilities, strategic capabilities, or on the conventional front. I don't entirely agree. India has, of course, several conventional weaknesses that India is still trying to address. But I'm not entirely sure that India has been completely weakened to the point that India is now actually sort of increasing the salience of nuclear weapons in its military thinking or its strategic thinking. I don't think that is really the case.
I don't think either I or Dr. Ahmed has
Anyway,
made this.
that's a sense I got from Ahmed's comment, that because of the conventional weakness, because that's a traditional argument that a lot of people have made. And I think that's been generally the case. If you have conventionally weak, then you try and bring out the salience importance of nuclear weapons in your grand strategic thinking, because you want to, that's generally the point. But I don't think India is there yet. India was forced upon to fight a border war with China since also almost 5 years, and we are fighting. Despite the limitations, we continue to hold the fort, and I think that would be continued to the case. But India is also constantly mindful of the two-front scenario, or even two and a half. If we were to look at the internal security scenario for context for India, there might be a two and a half front scenario that India has always been prepared for, at least in the last couple of decades. So that will continue to be the case. Is there a need for conflict resolution, conflict management, CBMs, hotlines, all of that? Yes, because given the kind of geographical proximity of India, China, and Pakistan, I think that's always a good thing to be done. And I think given the because globally, I don't think there's going to be an arms control that's going to happen anytime in the near future. Given the kind of great power competition, given the kind of intensification of the balance of power dynamics, I don't see global rule-making exercise, whether it is an arms control measure in the form of a legally binding process or a political agreement, none of that coming through anytime soon. Which also means that we need to think about some of these things in a regional, smaller context, whether it is among the three nuclear states in the Southern Asian context, or bringing in other countries, slightly an expanded group. I would generally believe and argue and make a case for smaller groupings to start this kind of conversation. That I am with you entirely. But I don't think, and the need for more hotlines, standard operating procedures, I think these are the kind of things that we need to think through. In case of an emergency, what is the standard lines of communication? Do you have a line of communication with your adversary, or with on the other side? Are you able to pick up the phone? Is there a number for you? Is there a number for you to call if there is an emergency, if there is a contingency that suddenly happens?
But there are numbers, but those numbers, for instance, the foreign secretary's hotline was basically not used at all. The DGMO's hotline was not used for many hours because India was trying to plan on how to retaliate after Operation Swift Retort. Forgive me, Rajagopalan, but I'm a little hard-pressed to agree with you with reference to India's thinking about, we did the test because of China. Frankly, I mean, of course, you are entitled to your view, and nobody can, say that you can't say that. There is a China, there is a nuclear-capable China, so obviously India can make that argument. But frankly, for India to think that it can compete with China either at a conventional level or at a nuclear level is a bit of a stretch. We've seen what happened at the line of actual control, and we've seen how, I mean, the Indian Prime Minister himself was bitterly criticized by the opposition, and even former military officers were saying that China does not occupy an inch of Indian land. So India was bending backwards to try and placate China. But of course, in terms of its own modernization and triad and the rest of it, it will continue to do what it is doing, which it can as a sovereign state, and continue to pin that on a threat perception from China. But I want to bring in Dr. Ahmed here. So what do we do here, in Pakistan with reference to India's constant refrain with reference to we are doing this because there is China, and China is of course doing it because there's the United States. So that's one thing. The other thing that I know, because you have done work on this whole use of methodology in terms of figuring out who has got how many warheads, and I also believe that you have been critical of the methodologies used to determine this. So I want you to say a few words about that.
So in terms of the capabilities, as I said earlier, given the geographical proximity and the fact that even today, 80% of all Indian offensive assets in the air and land domain are deployed against Pakistan, the repurposed, redeployed capabilities can be repositioned against Pakistan during a crisis. Now, having said that, I think the situation along the line of actual control is not going to change drastically for the foreseeable future. But what Dr. Raji just mentioned earlier, I think it's probably important to have a different perspective on the timelines of the nuclear developments in South Asia. I think India restarted its weaponization program around 1986-87. From the 74 to 86, they were producing fissile material, but were not really weaponizing. It was around 1986-87, and that was in response to certain statements coming out of Pakistan and reports of Pakistan's own capabilities. And India's 1998 tests themselves were in response to Pakistan's testing of a intermediate range ballistic missile, the Ghori, in April 1998. Although the BJP already had that in their manifesto, but that test proved to be the trigger. So we can debate on that, but even more important is the fact that India, my perspective has always been that neither Pakistan nor India nor China have made any declarations about their stockpiles of fissile materials usable for nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons programs of all three countries, of course, China is an NPT state, but India and Pakistani weapons programs are outside the scope of IAEA safeguards. Now, in India's case, much of India's nuclear energy program, three-stage program, while it is civilian, but it is outside safeguards, and this was part of the separation plan agreed by the NSG and the IAEA in 2008. So I'd like to just give a few figures, and these figures are from the International Panel on Fissile Materials. So what happens is that every year we have a new, or every second year, there is a new assessment coming out of the Federation of American Scientists, or the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, saying that India has 172 warheads, Pakistan has 170 warheads, China has 500 warheads. In the absence of any declarations, they are only looking at deployed systems, and those are estimates. And so it is probably more, it'll be more accurate to look at the capabilities, especially the latent capabilities in both China and India, because these are the two nuclear armed states that are increasing the size of their arsenals through the latency offered by their expanding civilian energy programs, of course, outside the scope of IAEA safeguards. So as per this FAS SIPRI estimates, China has about 600 warheads, deployed warheads, India about 172, and Pakistan around 170. But if you look at the warhead potential, and I'm talking of weapon usable fissile materials, including highly enriched uranium, and both civilian and weapons grade plutonium. Now, there is a debate in the American community of whether civilian plutonium or reactor grade plutonium can or cannot be used in nuclear weapons. I think before I proceed further, I'd like to make a clarification here that the United States conducted several tests using reactor grade plutonium in the early 1960s. These were proof of principle tests that established for a fact that this material or any isotopic composition of plutonium is suitable for producing weapons of the required yield. And this report was then declassified in 1997 by the US Department of Energy. And India itself has claimed that it has conducted at least one test in 1998 using civilian plutonium from its pressurized heavy water reactors, which, by the way, produce a much better quality of civilian plutonium than light water reactors. So in terms of the warhead potential, if you look at the HEU stocks and the weapons grade plutonium stocks of China, I think the potential is around 1425 warheads. And I'm not saying that this material has been weaponized, but this is the potential, and the IAEA believes that this material can be quickly weaponized in a matter of weeks. In terms of India, I think they have, if you only look at the weapon grade stockpiles of HEU and plutonium, they have a capacity of producing 225 warheads. And they already have around 9 to 10 tons of civilian plutonium they're separated, which is outside safeguards, which is sufficient for 1,200 warheads. So if all of that material that, in addition to this, which is outside safeguards, were to be weaponized, so they have a capacity of anywhere between 25 to 33,000 warheads. Now, this is the capacity. This is similar studies have been made about Japan and China. And in terms of Pakistan, I think the warhead potential, if all the material is converted into warheads, is around 375 warheads. But even more important is the growing capabilities, the expansion in the existing nuclear energy and fuel cycle infrastructures. So while India has continued to produce weapons-grade plutonium since 1960, China stopped producing weapons-grade plutonium and highly enriched uranium around 1989-90. And China has only started working on its fast breeder reactor program around 2017. So they've started working on two 600 megawatt fast breeder reactors, one of which has been commissioned now, and the other one is likely to be commissioned in another couple of years. And this is after several years when India started working on its own 500 megawatt prototype fast breeder reactor in 2004, which is now in the process of being commissioned. So if you look at the potential of increasing the stockpiles from these, so China's two fast breeder reactors, if they, once they are commissioned, they will be able to produce sufficient weapons grade plutonium for about 43 warheads per year each. If India is able to commission its first prototype fast breeder reactor in maybe by 2026, it will increase the capacity of its existing capacity from 26 kilograms to 146 kilograms of weapons grade plutonium, which is sufficient for about 36 warheads. And India has plans for an additional 5 fast breeder reactors as part of its three-stage nuclear energy program. So the increase will exponentially be factored in its potential over the coming years. Pakistan has only added 3 additional reactors of 50 megawatt between 1998 and 2015, which is less than the thermal capacity of one of India's unsafeguarded power reactor. And it has not increased its enrichment capacity for many years.
Can I respond?
I'm
Can I
fascinated.
just
I'm fascinated. No, I just want to say that I'm fascinated by all these numbers, frankly, because unlike you guys, I don't have a PhD in nuclear strategy, but since I've done a lot of work, it has always I found it somewhat ironical also and funny also that we talk about these things in such a sanitized manner sometimes, as if we're dealing with a weapon which is not any different from any other weapon. Dr. Ahmed talked about proximity. We talk about proximity between India and Pakistan. And I'm always reminded of the fact of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What exactly was the basis for that crisis? It was proximity. With the Soviet Union having put the missiles much closer to the US mainland, where the eastboard cities could have been taken out by the Soviet missiles. And for 13 days, the world came to very close to the brink of a nuclear war in order for the United States to get the Soviets to get the missiles out of Cuba. But yeah, Dr. Rajagopalan, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, the reality, you can have all these numbers, the potential capability, potential fissile material out there for India to expand its arsenal and all of that stuff. But what have you seen from 98 so far until now? What is the expansion? In fact, in between, not the latest figures, but in between, actually, Pakistan's nuclear arsenal was even slightly bigger than India's. But India was not panicking that, yeah, Pakistan's arsenal is big and China is growing at a faster pace. China is undertaking a sudden and massive expansion that we don't want to talk about it. fine. But I think from an Indian perspective, that is, you may not agree with it, but I think that's for the Indian policymakers, Indian strategic community that I interacted with, that is the primary focus. And given the kind of nature of relationship that exists between India and China today, and which is going to continue for a relatively long period of time, that I foresee, India has to focus on. So if China is expected to, the latest Chinese nuclear notebook from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists now say 600 nuclear warheads. It's already gone up to from 300 to 350 and 500, and now it is 600 warheads. We are not even talking about the yield. Forget about talking about yield, because it does not really make sense to me. But if China continues at the pace which it is doing, it is going to have India to come up with some response, and which is what I gathered from my interviews as well. Whether it is 1,000, it will have some certain amount of response. But if it is 1,500 by 2035, it is going to have a much different response, because it will bring that kind of pressure on in India, even in terms of conventional capability, conventional conflict, and so on and so forth. So the kind of response mechanisms that India would need to have, the response calculations.
I get your point. I get your point. I won't, because we're sort of coming close to the finish line also for this program, so I won't kind of fast pace it. The clarification is that no one, at least not me, I'm not saying that India cannot determine its responses. I mean, it's a sovereign country, it can. My point is that the same argument can be used by Pakistan in relation to India.
Okay.
We have also seen, for instance, there are a number of technology demonstrators. We know that the Indians have basically upended the process, or turned it around, if you will, and used the Space Launch Vehicle program to develop ICBM, to develop IRBMs and MRBMs and ICBMs. The other countries have done it differently. They developed their ICBMs and then developed their SLBs. We need to have SLBs. I'll be the first to concede that. We need to have SLBs. I mean, final statement on the last legs of Biden's lame duck administration was a leap of imagination on his part. But the fact is that SLBs, there is no international regimen that prevents any country developing space capabilities per se. We need them for ISR and for a number of reasons. My point is that these reactions are taking the world away from safety into greater uncertainty. I would also make this point, which has been made by Jeffrey Knopf very nicely, about the distinction between uncertainty and risk. Lots of nuclear strategists conflate these two issues. You can calculate risk, but uncertainty is a completely different animal altogether. Then, in this particular report, the USIP report, you mentioned China's dual-capable missiles. The entire world and Charlie's aunt are using dual-capable missiles. I mean, you think the Iranian missiles are not dual-capable? As a matter of fact, a number of strategists are now talking about this whole, which again, creates more risk in terms of non-nuclear strategic weapons. They're basically dual-capable missiles. So, and this is the point where I want to segue into what you have also mentioned. The changing geopolitical environment in ways where there's a conversation going on in Japan, for instance. There's a conversation going on in South Korea. There is a conversation going on in Germany about either having a non-US nuclear umbrella or developing nuclear weapons themselves. So are you concerned that we are entering a period where there is a greater likelihood of conflicts spiraling into the nuclear domain?
Yeah, possibly. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, we did have a period of, despite the weakness of the NPT, I think it prevailed quite successfully for a reasonable amount of time, wherein, because you do not see the prediction of having 25 nuclear weapon states come into reality. So I think there have been certain amount of success stories that you can attach to NPT. But at the same time, I think circumstances have changed, geopolitical environment, change of balance of power dynamics. All of these are important contextualizing factors for the kind of developments, the kind of debates that we are seeing today in terms of the nuclear possibilities. Those kind of debates in Japan, South Korea, and now, of course, in Europe, in a much more emphatic fashion, in the context of Ukraine, the US sort of security guarantee. I think that has always been there. Whether the US credibility of the US security is always been an issue for allies. That credibility question is not something new, but it has achieved, it has received certain heightened sense of importance in this particular point of, at this particular point of time. And I think that is pushing countries to think about what are the ways to secure themselves. Is there a kind of a European nuclear umbrella that other countries are going to be able to be providing, whether it is France, UK, or now other countries thinking about along such lines, and so on and so forth. This is an unfortunate sort of a development, but I think it's inevitable, possibly inevitable in the current context. And I think driven by China's own expansion, I think there have been other talks in the East, in the broader Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific context. I think that's something that it's unavoidable, and that is something to happen. India, by the way, does not have an ICBM even now. India's longest range that it is kind of developed but not operationalized is
Agni 5, they claim is.
Agni 5. Indian government can claim, but technically we know that it is not an ICBM. So let's just
Okay.
to rest that.
But are you saying that India is not working towards an ICBM?
It has been working on this Agni 5 for how many years? I'm not holding my breath. It may be working.
There I agree with you. There I agree with you. I wasn't holding.
So there may be a research and development program into Agni 6, Agni 7, Agni 10, but how soon are we getting there? Yeah. I would take a spoon of salt when I look at some of the efficiency in which these missile systems have been developed. So.
Yeah, okay. I'll take your word for that. But that obviously is not because India doesn't want to develop it. It's because of various technical glitches and bureaucratic, whatever, foot dragging and the rest of it. Yeah. But Dr. Ahmed, some final words with reference to where the world is going. Frankly, from where I stand when I look at the world, I'm constantly, in the recent past, reminded of Ted Hughes's poem, Apple Tragedy, which appends the book of Genesis and ends by saying, and everything goes to hell. So give me a sense of where you think things stand. By the way, both of you are in Australia, and it's interesting. I was having a conversation with some Australian diplomats a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about AUKUS and the Virginia-class submarines, and the fact that the Australians have already paid upfront, whereas the American capacity to actually build the submarines in terms of cadence, 1, 2, 3 it's not 2, it's 1.2, and so the U.S. Navy itself does not have enough of those Virginia-class submarines. And going by Trump's America First policy, the likelihood is, as Malcolm Turnbull has also said, likelihood is that the Australians are not getting those submarines. But the fact is that the world is going in a direction which seems to be not very reassuring, to put it charitably. Dr. Ahmed.
So, of course, the nuclear order is in a flux, and I think this is indeed the third nuclear age, where it's not just going to be nuclear, but strategic conventional capabilities that will be an important factor in determining the state of strategic stability amongst the nuclear armed states. But before we end, I'd just like to make a clarification. I never mentioned that India has that many warheads. What I said was that this is a latent capacity, which is there. And latency is there in Japan as well. It is in South Korea as well. It is there in China as well. The second important point is that there is no doubt that given the scope and size and direction, China has the fastest growing nuclear weapons program and the fastest modernizing program in the world. But if you look at the nuclear submarine programs of India and China, both countries are heavily investing in second strike, assured second strike capabilities. And from the open source literature, I mean, India has two Arihant class, two S4 and one S4 and S4 plus SSBN in various stages of being commissioned, and has plans for at least three S5 class SSBNs. So based on the vertical launch VLS tubes in these submarines, there can be variations. I think these submarines can have anywhere between 72 to 216 warheads, depending on the type of the SLBMs, whether they are MIRVed or not. Similarly, China has an ambitious and a fast developing nuclear submarine program, SSBN program, in addition to nuclear attack submarine program. They're still not there. Their SSBNs are very noisy, but they are moving in that direction. And if you consider the VLS tubes of their 094 and 096, upcoming 096 type SSBNs, China will be able to deploy around 200 to 850 warheads on submarines alone, depending on the types of the SLBMs, whether they are MIRVed or whether they are not MIRVed. Now, these are capabilities, and we really don't know what will be the exact posture of the triad of India and China in the coming years. So my arguments were based on capabilities that are latent, but that are developing. And those capabilities can mature, will of course mature over time, and will have an impact on the force postures and the doctrines of both countries.
Right. You know, it's interesting because if we accept that capabilities, intent, and outcomes are not correlated perfectly, and I don't think they are, then obviously, in order to understand what a particular state is doing, and in this case, China, it becomes quite a challenge unless one is wedded to linear thinking. I am also, I think I'd be remiss if I don't mention that secret war game in '83, which is, declassified Proud Prophet. That war game in near sort of real circumstances, open-ended, not scripted, which ended in a nuclear catastrophe. So I think this whole idea of developing these capabilities, and then these capabilities merging with emerging technologies, non-nuclear strategic weapons, the conflation of nuclear and conventional forces. For instance, I've been positing this question about what happens, for instance, in this Russo-Ukraine thing, if a non-nuclear strategic Ukrainian missile takes out a Russian SSBN. How would Russia respond? How does it complicate the entire issue of deterrence? So a number of questions, and we really don't have many answers to those questions. And of course, that's good for the club because it'll keep the club going. In any case, thank you so much, Dr. Rajagopalan, Dr. Ahmed, for being on the program. This is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. It doesn't get me any lucre, so don't think that it's about money, but it's going to make me happy, and it also helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.